I'm Ralph Gable of the Electronics for the Inquisitive Experimenter YouTube channel. If you find this video helpful, please click on the like and subscribe to the channel so you can get more videos as they come out. This is the second in a 3-video series on tuning duplexers. In the first video, I covered the foundations of definitions needed to understand what is in this process. In this second video, I'm actually going to teach you how to tune the duplexer, and in the third video, I will address hybrid ring duplexers. So you're going to be tuning a hybrid ring duplexer. Be sure to watch the video on this subject first. They're easily identifiable by the macrame-like wad of cabling and the plunger-style capacitor terminations. So, let's get ready to tune a duplexer. Well, before we get into the actual tuning process, I want to point out that every duplexer is different, and not every duplexer performs as well as other duplexers do. And if you don't know what the duplexer is capable of, all you can do is tune it for the best possible performance, whether we're talking about return loss, insertion loss, or the rejection. All through this video I talk about shooting for 35 dB or better return loss, and that's because that's my personal goal when I'm tuning a duplexer. I want to hit that minus 35 or minus 50, whatever I can do, and very fine little tweaks to get that. And the same thing with the rejection. My goal is to get the very best rejection out of a duplexer, regardless of what the specifications say or what other people's expectations are. And this always takes time to accomplish these things, and very fine tweaks and a lot of patience. The other thing I want to point out is I don't mention it here in the up-and-coming videos as I'm tuning the duplexer, but a duplexer is a 3-port device, and so you're going to have your measurement instrument connected to 1 port or 2 ports depending upon what you're measuring, but all the ports of the duplexer need to be terminated. So when you're doing return loss, not only do you need to terminate the antenna connector, but you also need to terminate the opposing side of the duplexer as well, and then connect your test instrument up to the side that you're tuning. So just remember, all ports need to be terminated either with a 50 ohm load or with the cables going to your measurement instrument when you're making the measurements. Now, on to actually tuning the duplexer. Well, the very first part of the task of getting ready to tune a duplexer is making sure that you have the right equipment to do the job. Now, you could use a spectrum analyzer, but it needs to have a tracking generator. But you can't just use this. You need a directional coupler to go with that so that you can measure return loss. And you say, well, what exactly is a tracking generator? Well, it's a built-in signal generator inside the spectrum analyzer. And as the spectrum analyzer sweeps across the frequencies that it's looking at, the tracking generator tracks along with it and generates a signal for it to look at. The directional coupler is something that you connect to the output of the tracking generator as a signal source and to the signal input of the spectrum analyzer, and it allows the spectrum analyzer to see the power being reflected back from the unit that you're testing, something called a transmission reflection test set, such as what I'm going to be using here, the Hewlett-Packard 85044A, which is an ancient one, but it works. It does the job that we need. Now, while the spectrum analyzer mentioned above will do an adequate job, it cannot take into account the effects of the cables you use to connect the duplexer to it. These can and do make some differences. Now, the preferred instrument to use for tuning a duplexer is the vector network analyzer, also known as the VNA. Now, there is a great preponderance of these VNAs out there. You have the mini VNA Tiny, they have the nano VNAs, and so on and so forth. But the one thing why those little inexpensive VNAs can't do the job is something called dynamic range. Their dynamic range might be 70 dB, and for either the spectrum analyzer or the network analyzer, whichever one that you choose to use, you need to have an instrument that has at least 100 dB or more of dynamic range. And with the vector network analyzer, you want a calibration kit with it as well. So when we're tuning a duplexer, what are we going to be adjusting? That's the next thing that we're going to be addressing. Well, before you change anything, it's a good idea to understand what we're going to be adjusting. These are band pass, band reject filters. As such, we're going to be adjusting what frequencies they pass and what frequencies they reject, but not quite the way you might expect. Now you see these screwdriver adjustments on the top, or not screwdriver, but plungers. These are called plungers. And these plungers adjust the return loss at the pass frequency. So that's what these are. They have little nuts here for tightening it down so they cannot be inadvertently moved. And then you have the actual plunger. In this case, this plunger is a screw type thing, so you turn this. Now, not all duplexers have a screw type adjustment like this. Some of them, it's just a smooth little plunger that you have to move up and down, and it's a real tedious process to tune those particular kinds. And then for the band reject, you have the screwdriver adjustment. In the case of this particular band pass, band reject duplexer, it's underneath this little cap that I just took off, and this adjusts for the reject frequency of the cavity. If you have something that has a little cover like this, be sure not to lose the little covers. They are there for a reason. So when you're adjusting the plungers for return loss, you're looking to get a return loss of the entire duplexer of minus 35 dB or lower. So if you get minus 50, that's great. And then the little capacitor adjustments here for the entire duplexer, you're looking at minus 80 dB generally, or lower might be a reject as low as minus 100 dB depending on the duplexer, but most of them run right around minus 80. So next we have to make a plan of what we're going to be tuning for. So the first step is you have to make a plan. You have to know what you're doing before you begin. You have to decide which side of the duplexer is going to be your transmit side and which is going to be your receive side. Now, the cavities might already be labeled high pass and low pass. And keep with this labeling. It very well may have been there for a technical reason, or maybe not. But knowing this, you have to determine what the pass and reject frequencies are going to be for each side. Do yourself a favor. Take a pad of sticky notes, write down your pass and reject frequencies for each cavity on the sticky note, and stick a sticky note on each cavity. It is amazing how many times you'll have to stop and think, okay, now this cavity, the pass frequency is supposed to be, and the reject is, and this just eliminates all of that. You don't have to keep that in your head. It's right there in front of you while you're tuning the cavities. Now, for the sake of this demonstration, for this video, I'm going to be tuning a set of commercial UHF cavities. Now, these have already been labeled low pass and high pass, and so that's what I'm going to be working with as I move ahead with this demonstration. Now, in my case, I've decided that the cavities that include the dark guy is going to be my receive side, and the other side is going to be my transmit side. And I'm looking at, okay, I want to put in a UHF repeater, and the frequency pair is 442 megahertz is going to be the output side, and 447 megahertz is going to be the input side. So what does that mean to me as I'm tuning the duplexer? That means that the transmit side is going to be the low pass, because I want to pass 442 megahertz, that's my output frequency. I want to reject 447 megahertz, that's my input frequency. And then on the receive side, it's going to be the high pass, because I want to pass 447 megahertz, and I want to reject 442 megahertz. So I got my plan down, and I have my labels, my sticky notes on my duplexer cavities. But at this point, you still have to decide what your tuning track is going to be. Now, if your cavities are way tuned far afield frequency-wise from the frequency that you are intending the cavities to be tuned to, you're on track 1. But if they're pretty close, let's say you're just tweaking up and cleaning up the tuning on a duplexer that's already been tuned very, very closely, or even on the frequencies that you're intending to tune it for, then you can go directly to track 2. In any event, if you're in track 1, you do this initial tuning to get everything close, and then you drop down to track 2. So track 2 is always going to be done. The question is, do I need to go into track 1 first? Now, if you're not absolutely sure which way to go, how close is this duplexer tuned, then you have to find out where it is tuned and how badly out of tune it is, because you could have gotten this duplexer from who knows whom, and all of the cavities could be tuned to different frequencies. You don't know that. So you need to find out where it's tuned in order to get an idea of where you're going to be in track 1 or track 2. So how do we know where it's tuned? That's the next real big question we're going to answer. So if you don't know where a duplexer is presently tuned, you need to find out where it is tuned in order to find out how far away from your target frequencies the duplexer is at. And so where is it tuned now? What we're going to do is we're going to look at the reject frequencies of the duplexer. Now, this business of finding the present tuning is just a ballpark thing. We're not looking for precise measurements and all of this other stuff. You don't need to go through the calibration procedure for your VNA to do this. It's just a general idea of where the duplexer is tuned. So now let's go to our duplexer and see where this old commercial UHF duplexer is tuned. So now you can see I've already made the plan. I have my cavities individually labeled for what their band pass and band reject frequency that I want them to be. You have, in this case, this would be the transmit side over here, and that would be where the transmitter gets connected. Over here we have the receive side, and this is where the receiver gets connected. And this one here, this is the antenna or common terminal. This is where the antenna gets connected. So the first thing that we do to find out where these are initially tuned is we take a good 50 ohm load and we connect it up to the antenna connector on the duplexer. So now you can see I have the 50 ohm load installed on my duplexer. Next I'm going to take the tracking generator output, which is my blue labeled cable, and I'm going to connect it up to a port here. And then I'm going to take the signal input and connect it to the other end of the duplexer. So now that means that the tracking generator signal has to pass through this side, through here, through this side, and to here. So we are going to be able to see the reject of this side and the reject of this side. Next we have to set up our spectrum analyzer so that its start and stop frequencies include all of the suspected frequencies that we think that this duplexer might already be tuned to. So in this particular case, I expect these cavities to have been tuned somewhere between 400 and 450 megahertz. And so I set that up on my spectrum analyzer and I turned on the tracking generator. And what we're looking for are two distinct dips. Now I've turned on two separate markers, one for this dip, one for this dip. This is kind of wide, so it kind of feels like it's probably not very well tuned up here. But notice the frequencies of the two markers. One marker is at 443 megahertz, one's at 433 megahertz, the other one's at 444 megahertz. So that gives me an idea where this duplexer is currently tuned. And if we look at the frequencies that I'm interested, 447 and 442, we can see that these two frequencies, the 434 megahertz, is very much so far afield of what I want these things to be tuned to. So it looks like I'm going to have to go into track 1 of tuning for the duplexer. If you're using a vector network analyzer, the connections to the duplexer are the same, and then we connect up to the vector network analyzer, and I set up the span the same as the spectrum analyzer and my markers here. Measurement wise, you're looking at S21 is what you're looking at. So the signal comes out of 1, goes to the duplexer, comes back onto port 2. And so here you can see marker 1 is at 432.875 and marker 2 is at 444 megahertz. So if your duplexer isn't tuned to anything specific, if it had been played with and things are all in different places, then you're going to see more than two distinct little pips on the screen. You might see 3, you might see, like in the case of this one here, you saw one very distinct dip and then you saw one big wide one. And that says, well, you know, that's not quite tuned as well as it should be to whatever that frequency is. And I kind of estimated where it was tuned based on the kind of the center of that pip. And in that case, I say, well, it's not tuned to anything in particular, and maybe I need to go to track 1 first. But if it is tuned to something, you're going to see these very definite pips that are at least 70 dB down or more, and that gives you an idea of where your where your duplexer is tuned, and how far afield those dips are will tell you whether you need track 1 or track 2. And like I said before, in my particular case, this duplexer is tuned quite far afield of where I want to be. So, I mean, 9 megahertz away, I'd say that's far afield. So I'm going to begin the process going into track 1, the initial tuning of a duplexer. And so now we enter track 1, the initial tuning of your duplexer if it's already been far afield of where you want it to be. Now, but first of all, I need to point out that hybrid ring duplexers are kind of a different kind of animal, and I strongly advise you to check out the next video in this series on hybrid ring duplexers before you attempt to tune your hybrid ring duplexer, if that's what you're working on. Well, the very first thing we have to do is we have to prepare the duplexer for this initial step. The first step in preparing your duplexer for tuning is to label everything. You'll notice here I have little orange marker here, I have an orange marker here, and if I can get around so you can see it, there is, oh, there's the dog, my mascot. There's an orange marker on the connector here. You'll notice that next to this connector is a yellow dot, and there's a yellow dot here. We come to the antenna cable. We come to the other side and around, and now I have a gold dot here. There is a gold dot that I put on this connector, and then over here we see we have little blue dots, and I also put blue dots on this connector. Now, no matter what anyone tells you, the lengths of these cables do make a difference between the cavities on the cables, and that's why we're labeling everything, so we can be sure to put everything back exactly where it came from. So the first step is, now that you've labeled all of the cables so you know exactly where they came from, we're going to take all of those cables off of the duplexer. So now all my cables have been removed from the duplexer. Now I have to finish preparing here. We want to loosen each of these locking nuts that are on here. Now, in the case of the duplexers that have the smooth plunger, you want to loosen them, but not, you want the plunger to move with some difficulty, so you don't want it too loose. In this case, these, I already loosened these up, but you can see they're all loose. And then in this case I have these little capacitor caps here, so I got a little pill bottle so I don't lose them, and I take the little capacitor caps off. That way I can get at the capacitors easily. And I've already labeled each of the cavities, so I know exactly what frequency that they're supposed to be tuned to. And so now we are ready to start the initial tuning of our duplexer. The first step in tuning a duplexer cavity is tuning the return loss, which affects the pass frequency of the duplexer cavity. To do that with a spectrum analyzer, you need a spectrum analyzer with tracking generator and a directional coupler. Now, you set your start and stop frequencies so that they coincide with all of the frequencies that it's currently tuned to, as well as the frequencies that are your target frequencies. You turn your tracking generator on for 0 dB output, and I set 2 markers here for myself. each one of these markers, if we were to zoom in here, you would see the markers are set to my pass and reject frequencies as points of reference to make it easier to tune. Now notice that while my tracking generator is set to 0 dB, you will notice that what's coming back from my directional coupler is at minus 20 dB. And if that was a perfect directional coupler, then that would be coming back at 0 dB, but it's not. So that's my reference point. I know that it's at minus 20 dB with an open here. So now let's connect it up to our duplexer. We put a perfect 50 ohm load, or a high quality 50 ohm load on the output on one side of the duplexer cavity. And then we connect our cable up to the other side of the cavity. And then we connect our cable up to the directional coupler so that we can look at the return loss. Alright, so we are completely connected. We are ready to begin the tuning of the first cavity to get it in, and you'll notice there's this little dip right there. Now that dip is well above, well, let's see, this cavity, we want it to be passing 447 megahertz. And that is well above the 447 megahertz, so we need to tune the plunger to move that little pip over so that it coincides with our second marker here. Now as I move the plunger with my wrench, you notice how that's moving. If I go the other way, you notice it's going up and down. And so I'm just going to keep moving that plunger until it hits that little mark right there. That's where I want it. That gets me within the ballpark of where I want to be. So if you have one of those duplexers with the smooth rods, you grab the top of the rod and you tap on the side as you pull gently on the rod so that the rod would come up. And if you need to go down with it, you take your wrench very gently and tap on the top of the rod to get it to go down and in. If you're using a vector network analyzer, you go through the same process. Make sure you have a good 50 ohm load on one side. Connect your cable for the vector network analyzer up to port 1. Measurement type, you want S11 or reflection. And you have the same setup as far as frequencies. I have my two markers set up here, and here is my pip way down here. So now I'm going to tune the plunger to bring it up to my first marker, which is at 442 megahertz. So we've completed tuning the return loss on each of the cavities for their respective pass frequencies. Now we get to tune for the reject frequencies with the little screwdriver adjustment that exists up here on the top. It was underneath that little cap there. To do that, first of all, we've removed our directional coupler. We've connected the tracking generator output here to the receiver side. We've connected the signal input of the spectrum analyzer to the antenna side of the duplex cavity. And now we can see here on the screen our little pip, which is the reject. You can see this is the pass, and look how close to 0 dB that is. That's really nice. You want that up there. And you want this as low as possible. So now we're going to adjust our little screwdriver adjustment to move this pip down so it coincides with the reject frequency for that cavity. Alright, so now I'm going to adjust our little screwdriver, and you can see it moving as I turn the screwdriver adjustment. I'm not turning it very far. Gentle, gentle, gentle. Think about turning it. And there we are, right where, oh, see, I passed it. And right there at its minimum there, that's 44 dB down, that little pip there, which is really good. And the little pip up at the 2 is only about 1 dB down. If you're using a vector network analyzer to tune a duplexer, then you connect your port 1 to 1 and port 2. This is the antenna side. This is the side for port 2 of your vector network analyzer. This is the receiver side. Then we set up our measurement type as S21, so we're sending a signal out port 1, going through the duplexer, and coming back to measure it at port 2. Now I have my same markers here, marker 1, marker 2, and now we need to adjust our little screwdriver capacitor adjustment to move this little pip to the reject frequency for the receive side, which is 442 megahertz. Well, now that we have tuned each of the individual cavities for their return loss at their pass frequency and their rejection at their reject frequency, we now can put all the cables back together onto the duplexer exactly where they came from. Make sure they're nice and snug. It does make a difference whether the connectors are nice and snug and tightened down in place. Don't over tighten them, but make sure they're all nice and snug in place. And so now we are ready to go on into the final tuning now that we got them all close. And so now we start track 2. This is where you begin if you already know your duplexer is tuned pretty close to the frequencies that you are interested in, or if you have now just finished tuning the individual cavities so you know that they're pretty close to where you want to be. The first step is you got to get set up to measure return loss using your directional coupler and your spectrum analyzer. You set your start and stop frequencies so that they are just either side of the target frequencies in question. You want to set up markers at the target frequency. So I have a marker for what I'm doing here at 442 and 447, which are the two frequencies that I am interested in. Now, notice that nothing is connected to the end of my cable here. So what I should end up with this cable is a return loss of 0 dB. But you'll notice if you look at the markers, it's actually minus 20 dB. So in my mind, that's my reference point. Any return loss that I get from my duplexer has to take that in consideration. Now, we had these pretty well adjusted to the specific frequency in question, but now they interact with one another because the cables have all been connected up. So we connect up a 50 ohm load to the antenna connector, and we're going to connect our our signal cable from our directional coupler up to where the receiver would connect to in this case. And then we're going to adjust the plunger for these two plungers are going to be adjusted so the blips, the return loss blips for each of the cavities coincide and give us a total return loss of minus 35 dB or more. Now, of course, we're starting out with a minus 20, so that would be minus 35, minus 20. So we're looking for a return loss around the minus 55 range. All right, now I'm all connected, and if we zoom in here, you can see that by connecting the two duplexer cavities together, the return loss blip isn't where we want it to be. We want it to be here because the pass frequency for the receive side wants to be 447 megahertz, and that's what that marker is. So you also notice that we have this little bump here and then the pip. So we are going to carefully adjust the plungers on those two cavities so that this pip, our goal is to get a single pip here that's at least at minus 55 dB or lower. If you're going to be tuning the duplexer using a vector network analyzer, now that you've entered track 2, you need to do a full 2-port calibration of the VNA. Highly recommend that. That will save you a whole bunch of steps. But first, set your start and stop frequencies so that it includes your start and stop frequencies of interest. Set your markers here for your reject and pass frequencies. Do your full 2-port calibration, and we're going to begin by doing a S11 measurement. We connect our cable from port 1 up to, in this case, the transmitter side of this cavity. We're going to put a good 50 ohm load here, and we're going to be tuning this side here. Initially, return loss at 442 megahertz. So we are of interest in this little return loss blip that happens to be right here. Notice that it is only at about, let's see if I can zoom in here. It's at about 17.5 dB, and we want at least 30, so we have some tuning to do. So with the return loss having been successfully tuned on our duplexer, we're going to now turn our sights to the rejection side. And to do that, first we have to take our directional coupler off. Alright, so now we've taken the directional coupler off. We've connected the tracking generator output to where the receiver normally would be connected. If we were doing the other half of this, we would be connecting it up to where the transmitter is connected. The signal input on the spectrum analyzer gets connected to the antenna connector, and we're going to be adjusting these little tweaks in here so that our rejection here looks like it should look. If you're using a vector network analyzer, the connections to the duplexer are the same. So now we have port 1 connected over here. We have port 2 connected to the antenna connector. We've set up for S21 measurement or response measurement. We've done an auto scale so that we have everything on the screen. Notice here for marker 1 what our insertion loss is on this cavity. Let's see, there it is, only 1.2 dB, which is really good. Now let's look at what our rejection is. Well, it says it is about minus 70 something dB. So now what we're going to be doing is tweaking our little screwdriver adjustments so that the two cavities, their rejection will coincide with each other, and this get a lot lower than it currently is. This duplexer now is completely tuned and ready to go into service. So we're not completely done yet. You say, I thought it was fully tuned and ready to go into service. Yes, but we have a little bit of an issue here. See? These are not tightened down. Be careful when you tighten these down to only snug them. And then even after you finish that process, you need to really go back and verify that your tuning has not shifted as a result of tightening your little nuts down. Because if you, with some duplexers especially, tightening these down can actually shift your tuning. And then don't forget to put all your little covers back on your capacitive tweaks as well. And then once it's all put back together, recheck the tuning and make sure that you're happy with it. And then you're done. And so what are the final numbers on our duplexer that we are tuning here? Well, it turns out the transmit side, which had the pass of 442 megahertz and the reject of 447 megahertz, the transmit side had a return loss of minus 27 dB, which isn't bad. It had a rejection of 96 dB, and the insertion loss is only about 1.05 dB at the pass frequency. The receive side, I ended up with a return loss of 32 dB, which is very good, and the rejection was 98 dB at the reject frequency, and then the insertion loss was 1.5 dB. So all in all, it's really not a bad duplexer for this particular application. The emphasis, again, is you can't get blood out of a stone. So you tune a duplexer for the best possible performance that you can get out of it. Have a lot of patience. Take your time to just barely tweak those things and watch and work at it. It can take a time to get everything lined up and giving you the best performance you can get. So there you go, how to tune a duplexer. If this video has been helpful to you, please click on the like and subscribe to the channel so that you can get future videos as they come out. In the meanwhile, thanks for watching. Toodaloots.